Hello, guys. Welcome to the show. It's your boy, A Truth and Set You Free. Hashtag SFTS. Search for the symbols. I want to give a shout out to all my supporters, everybody who subscribed, everybody who hit that like button, everybody who leave me comments. I thank y'all. I appreciate y'all so much. And thank y'all for your support. There's no me without you, and I cannot express it enough.
Hello, guys. Welcome back to the show. It's your boy, A Truth will Set You Free. There's no me without you, and I cannot express it enough. This is our latest entry into the History They Hide series. This video is going to be called How White Slaves Became Black Slaves. Black Europeans and Black Indians, not all blacks, are from Africa. Guys, we're going to indulge in how white slavery became black slavery and how they created the thought that all black people are slaves and all white people are superior. How they whitewash history and they turn everything into a slave narrative. And this is something that curses our people to this very day, that everybody thinks everything is about slavery, everything black is a slave, and everything black comes from Africa. What I have to say is that black people are indigenous to Europe and black people are indigenous to America. And this is something that they suppress and hide from us and try to make us think that this is not true, when it is very true. Black people don't only come from Africa. When you hear of a white person, they call them a European. Or a white person in America, they call them an American. But they try to throw the Afri on black people.
Slavery and its history today feels like taboo in discussions. It is one of the avoided things to talk about at this time. We cannot also deny that slavery has been around in different types of ethnicity and countries, many of which are often forgotten, and much worse, suppressed. Today on History in Minutes, we'll be diving deeper into the real history of the white slave trade. The narrative of slavery is more intricate than what has been presented to you. Were you aware that North Africa received up to 1.25 million white slaves? Did you know that 1/5 of the 1797 US government budget was used to pay tribute to North African Muslim nations to free and halt the enslavement of Americans? The Ottoman Empire enslaved millions of Europeans, and in ancient Britain, slavery was so pervasive that the term Breton was used interchangeably with slave.
Okay, guys, this is King James and Charles V, both melanated nobility in Europe. During this time, the time of colonization, nobility, black nobility was ruling in Europe. So white people were crooks, thieves, homeless people, robbers, all types of low-life people in Europe. Of course, they were whitewashed. These are supposedly them, but these are not the real them. They whitewashed all the nobility in Europe, but black was the leading nobility, and white people were of regular and lower class. That's why they came to America, because, you know, they were poor, they were convicts, they owed people money, they were trying to get out of Europe because their life wasn't so pleasant in Europe. And black people were the nobility at the time. The history of enslavement in America, as portrayed in a tunnel vision of the corporate media, has focused exclusively on the enslavement of Negroes. The impression is given that only whites bear the responsibility for enslaving Negroes and only Negroes were slaves. In fact, Negroes in Africa, as well as American Indian tribes such as the Cherokee, engaged in extensive enslavement of Negroes. The Cherokee Indians owned large plantations on which they worked their Negro slaves in gangs. White slaves were actually owned by Negroes and Indians in the South, to such an extent that the Virginia Assembly passed the following law in 1670. It is enacted that no Negro or Indian, though baptized and enjoyed their own freedom, shall be capable of any such purchase of Christians. Negroes also owned other Negroes. While whites languished in chains, blacks were free men in Virginia throughout the 17th century. So, whites were slaves in the beginning, okay? Black people came over here from Europe as indentured servants along with the white people. Some of them started getting land and owning plantations, and they started to have white slaves, and that's what happened in the beginning. But what happened was, when these white people got over here from Europe, they was tired of black people ruling them. They didn't want no black people being in charge of them. You know, they didn't want no Negroes. The Indians were black, so they want no black Indians, no black Europeans, no black Moors from Africa. They didn't want anybody ruling them. The rente right, servitude for life, had not existed in the colonies except for a small number of white convicts transported from the British Isles until Anthony and Mary Johnson, who were black, won a judicial determination making John Castor their servant for life. It was not until 1670 that Virginia legislature enacted the rente right, providing that all servants not being Christians imported into this colony by shipping are to be slaves for their lives, but such servants as come are to serve, if boys or girls, until 30 years of age, if men or women 12 years and no longer. Blacks and Indians came to own and abuse whites in Virginia in such large numbers that in 1670 the House of Burgesses proclaimed no Negro or Indian, though baptized and enjoyed their own freedom, shall be capable of any purchase of Christians, but yet not debarred from buying any of their own nation. Christian was euphemism of the period for Caucasian. Virginia's slave code of 1705 provided that no Negroes, mulattoes, Indians, or though Christians, or Jew, Moor, Mohammedans, or other infidels shall at any time purchase any Christian, nor any other except of their own complexion, or such are declared slaves by this act. So the black people were Negroes, mulattoes, Indians, Christians, Jews, and Moors, and Mohammedans. If this slave code was made against all the black people had to be Negroes, mulattoes, Indians, Christians, Jews, Moors, and Mohammedans. So some of the people that was fleeing persecution that came over here that were Christians had to be black also, and the Indians were black, and the Jews.
Let Hollywood tell the story, they would have you think that only black people experienced slavery. Traditionally, you would only see white Europeans as the ones that control the slaves when it comes to the history books. But what if I told you white slaves owned by Africans also existed and has appeared to be hidden from our history? The slave trade that many of us know is the transatlantic slave trade, which would involve over 12 million African slaves being shipped from Africa to North America. But why don't we hear about the time North Africans would own and trade a reported 1.2 million white European slaves during the Barbary slave trade from 1530 to 1780? This hidden slave trade would mainly take place off the Barbary coast and included the African cities of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers. And just like the transatlantic slave trade that would begin in the mid-1500s, it was a source of income for those involved. The Barbary slave trade consisted of North Africans, a part of the Ottoman Empire, who made white Christians their slaves through piracy. If you don't recall, many Africans were Muslim, and this appears to have played a huge reason as to why traveling white Christians were targeted. But before we had lost sight of land, we were captured by Algerian pirates, who put all the men in irons. This is a direct quote from Reverend DeVoe Spratt in April of 1641. Sailing with 120 passengers from Ireland to England. At the time, he was a newly ordained reverend at 21 when he would be captured by Algerian pirates and sentenced to slavery. The miserable destruction of 120 men, women, and children by sword, famine, and many diseases, amongst whom was my mother Elizabeth and my youngest brother Joseph. According to research, in those earlier times, the Mediterranean and the coast of North Africa will become known for piracy. African pirates figured that they could generate profit by hijacking European ships, raiding and robbing them, and enslaving their passengers for profit. In their eyes, they saw the ships as floating banks. Not only did they keep everything of value on the ships, with their captured slaves, they had an extended source of income, as many would hold their new white slaves for ransom, hoping their families would pay for their freedom. Those who were not held for ransom would have a life of servitude and labor, and more specifically for women, they could also become sex slaves, a part of the harems. According to the BBC, there were two categories for Barbary slaves. First, you had the public slaves. These slaves belonged to the ruling pasha, who by right of rulership could claim an eighth of all Christians captured by corsairs, and by all the others he wanted at reduced prices. These slaves were housed in large prisons known as benos, often in wretchedly overcrowded conditions. They were mostly used to roll the corsair galleys in pursuit of loot and more slaves. Work so strenuous that thousands died or went mad while chained to the oar. During the winter, these galeotes worked on state projects, quarrying stone, building walls or harbor facilities, felling timber, and constructing new galleys. Each day they would be given perhaps 2 or 3 loaves of black bread that dogs themselves wouldn't eat, and limited water. They received 1 change of clothing every year. Those who collapsed on the job from exhaustion and malnutrition were typically beaten until they got up and went back to work. The Pasha also bought most female captives, some of whom were taken into his harem, where they lived out their days in captivity. The majority, however, were purchased for the ransom value. While awaiting their release, they worked in the palace as harem attendants. The other groups of slaves belonged to private parties.
The English colony of Virginia was founded upon the soldiers of those in bondage. Most whites came to Virginia as indentured servants by way of headright system, and nearly all blacks came as slaves. That's a lie. Blacks came as indentured servants too, from Europe. However, Virginia in the early to mid 1600s lacked clear racial standards, as people of all races enjoy some degree of upward social mobility. See, people of all races enjoy this because everybody didn't come as a slave. Today, colonial Virginia is usually remembered for its heavy reliance on institutionalized racial slavery, but its social dynamic did not always reflect this viewpoint. While blacks were subject to few discriminatory practices as early as 1640s, they were not victims of the systematic racism that came to define the colony as early as 1705. Interracial marriage was common, and interracial couples who had offspring, though officially viewed as illegitimate children, were not subject to legal punishment. It makes sense then to question how Virginia came to be one of the most effectively racist slave societies in America. The answer lies in the conflict between the classes of white people in early Virginia. After these class conflicts came to a head in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion, the ruling planter class had to devise a way to draw attention away from the inequalities present within the white population of the colony. Its answer was to cement racism in Virginia's laws so that the poor whites would no longer want to topple the ruling class, but instead focus on maintaining their racially privileged position over blacks. According to the Virginia Slave Code of 1705, created a race-based social hierarchy as a means of resolving class conflict within the white community. Alright, so we have Anthony Johnson. He was a man from Angola who achieved wealth in the early 17th century colony of Virginia, held as a what? Indentured servant in 1621. He earned his freedom after several years and was granted land by the colony. He later became a tobacco farmer in the province of Maryland. He attained great wealth after completing his term as an indentured servant and has been referred to as the Black Patriarch of the first community of Negro property owners in America. In the early 1620s, African slave traders kidnapped the man, who would later be known as Anthony Johnson, in Portuguese Angola, and sold him to Portuguese slavers. And his name was Antonio. Okay, what guy from Angola name is Antonio? And he got kidnapped, but he's an indentured servant. Don't make sense. He sailed to Virginia in 1621 aboard the James. The Virginia muster 1624 lists his name as Antonio, recorded as a Negro in the notes. Historians dispute whether this was the same Antonio later known as Anthony Johnson. At the census list, several men named Antonio. This one is considered the most likely. Johnson was sold as an indentured servant to merchant Edward Bennett to work on his Virginia tobacco farm on the southern bank of the James River. Slave laws were not passed until 1661 in Virginia. Before that date, Africans were not officially considered to be enslaved. Okay? Was he a slave or an indentured servant? He was an indentured servant. So how could he get kidnapped? He was an indentured servant. And why would you sell an indentured servant? Doesn't make sense, all right? Such workers worked under limited indentured contract for 4 to 7 years to pay off their passage, all right? So he paid off his passage. That's why he was an indentured servant. In the early colonial years, Most Africans in the 13 colonies were held under such contracts of limited indentured servitude. So how was he kidnapped if he paid for his passage on the boat? Doesn't make sense. In 1623, a black woman named Mary arrived aboard the ship Margaret. She was brought to work on the same plantation as Antonio, where she was the only woman present. And they got married and lived together for more than 40 years. So this guy was most likely a European. He was black, but they try to label him an African. And this is what they do. They try to label everybody an African. All right, he could have been a Moor. He could have been somebody from the Iberian Peninsula. Most of them were melanated. And it says indentured servants paid for their passage, or whoever bought them paid for their passage. So the person that inquired them just paid for their passage, and they did the indentured servitude for the 7 years. So it's like their story don't make sense. They say he got kidnapped. The tension between poor and wealthy whites greatly influenced Bacon's rebellion and eventually led to Virginia's implementation of the Slave Code of 1705. In 1676, a settler named Nathaniel Bacon led a militia of poor Virginians in rebellion against the governor, William Berkeley. The rebels condemned Berkeley for his toothless policies towards Indians on the frontier and for his unjust land policies within the colony. See, these white slaves were getting upset that all, the black people was owning them, and they was doing that in Europe, and they was doing that over in the Iberian Peninsula and Europe. They were the slaves, so they got tired of it. They wasn't having it when they got to America. Berkeley was also known to place disproportionately high taxes on poor planters and to grant all of the best eastern lands to his friends. Poor Virginians also felt Berkeley's decisions had cheated them of a right to self-governance. See, they wanted to govern themselves. They didn't want to be governed by black people anymore. The nobility that was in Europe and the people from the Iberian Peninsula and the Moors, they were all black, and they had white people enslaved over there. The right of all free men to vote was ended in 1670 unless they met definite. Bacon's rebellion revealed the drastic power of racism, and the leader of the colony took this cue to pass the Slave Code of 1705. Virginia's ruling class realized that resentment of an alien race might be more powerful than resentment of the upper class, an alien race. You see how they word this stuff? With the Slave Code of 1705, legislators simply refocused the racist sentiments away from Indians and towards blacks. Although the code presented itself as an attack on the black slave population, it merely uses the guise of racism to protect ruling planters' interests by making concessions to the disgruntled poor white population. Article 7 of the code explicitly forbade the whipping of white servants and granted white servants the right to make complaints in court by protecting white servants, but granted no similar privileges to black slaves who are also in a state of servitude. This article confers superiority to white servants over their black peers. Moreover, the article improved the lot of white servants because the ruling class knew many white freedmen ended up returning to servitude shortly after earning their freedom. There was also 7 provisions in the code that addressed the issue of interracial relationships. So basically, while people were living like this in Europe, the black nobility, black people living normally over there in Europe, when the low class whites, the convicts and the thieves and the robbers and the homeless, when they got sent over here, they wasn't having it with black people ruling over them. So what they did was they began to revolt. They started the Bacon's Rebellion. All right, Indians were dark skinned at this time. They owned slaves. Negroes owned slaves. Even the indentured servants, they was flipping they money real quick. They was getting their land, and they was becoming slave owners really quick. But they started owning the whites, and the whites wasn't having it. So they started a rebellion. That's what they did. The institution of slavery took decades to evolve into the inherited race-based system that the Americans commonly think of as slavery. It wasn't until 1671 that the Virginia made all non-Christian servants newly shipped to slave colonies slaves for life. Muslim African, remember at this time, Muslim Africans along with Barbary coast were routinely enslaving European Christians, mainly in the Mediterranean. Alright, so Muslim Africans were still enslaving European Christians, okay? They were enslaving white people. White people were slaves. Slaves come from the word Slavs. 2 years later, the legislature validated the enslavement of Indians. Additional laws were passed piecemeal, but the system was not formalized until the enactment of Virginia's first slave code of 1705. Throughout most of 1600, Virginia planters relied heavily upon the indentured labor of English, Irish, Welsh, and Scottish servants, then Africans, okay? There was dark-skinned English, there was dark-skinned Irish, there was dark-skinned Welsh, and Scottish servants, alright? They try to act like everybody was an African. They try to act like only black people were Africans, okay? But there were Christians too, so the rules were for Christians, but there was Christian English, Irish, Welsh, Scottish. They were all escaping. They was all escaping for religious freedom from Europe. So a lot of them were black also. Alright, let's get to this European thing. The term African European or Afro-European is not widely used in Europe, where its equivalent, African American or Afro-American, is common across the Atlantic. I use this somewhat provocatively, but also and more importantly to highlight the fact that people of African descent have plural identity. African Americans have appropriated the term, but African Europeans are more reluctant to use it because of the historical context, as in Europe they're often referred to back to their African origin, even if they were born on European soil. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? If you're European, you're a European, alright? So black Europeans are now called African Europeans, like African Americans, like they reclassified us when we're just American. So like everybody's not from Africa. If you're born on a certain soil, that's what you are. Alright, so everybody who's black gets labeled African, and that's not fair because all black people don't come from Africa. If you're a European black person, you're a European or a black European. You know, nobody wants to be called black because black is just a color, so just call us by what we are, okay? American and European. If you're white, they call you a European or American, but if we're black, they have to throw the Afri on it or Afro. And that's just not right. And this is a classification that they put on us. All right. Back in early Europe, racism didn't exist. So it did not exist until the slave trade came, and then they ran with it. When the white people took control of America after the Civil War, they ran with it and whitewashed everything. The history of black people in Europe is generally considered to begin in the 17th and 18th centuries. Wow. And that's not true. It was way before that. You showed that they have been here for much longer. When we talk about the migration of the people from Africa to Europe, we tend to trace it back to the slave trade, but it's much older. People from the African continent have been present in Roman Empire since antiquity. All right, if they've been there since antiquity, that means they've been there as long as white people, and they are indigenous to there. In the absence of a census, it's difficult to access their numbers today. But what we do know is that some of them, because of illustrious figures, such as the Empire Septimius Severus, who was born in what is now Libya, and some thinkers such as St. Augustine, Aphilius, who came from North Africa, the presence continued over the centuries. Frederick II, King of Sicily and Holy Roman Emperor 1220 to 1250, welcomed Africans into his court and employed them in his service. That's another thing. They always try to make a black person in some type of servitude. He's always have to be in service. Like they wasn't King James, like they wasn't Charles V, like they wasn't Peter the first black king in Europe. Alright? All of the stewards were black. The Tudors were also black. Alright, red-headed, light-skinned. Some of them were light-skinned, but they were black. He even made one of them, John the Moor, his chamberlain. See, they always try to act like we was in some type of servitude. Until the end of the 15th century, Arab and North African Muslims ruled over most of the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, black people ran the Iberian Peninsula. So obviously they were in high nobility places when the Muslims ruled Europe. All right. In England, they have black nobility. In the Iberian Peninsula, that the Moors ruled Europe. All right. Europeans became aware of human diversity very early on, as there have been black people living in Europe since antiquity. There it goes right there. Black people have been living in Europe since antiquity. That means they're indigenous. In the late 15th century, some European cities had a significant proportion of black persons among their inhabitants, like Lipson, where they accounted for approximately 10% of the population. The term race was used at the time to designate lineage and genealogy. It was on this basis in the Iberian Peninsula that in the 16th century the idea of transgenerational transmission of impurities through the blood emerged. Such impurities included heresy, enslavement, and even the fact of having a Muslim or Jewish ancestry. What was then called purity of blood was the necessity condition for access in certain positions and dignities. Infections of the blood imposed a determination on individuals because of their genealogy. It was based on these old ideas that the idea of race crystallized in the 17th century to designate a group of individuals presenting common physical characteristics with which abilities and inabilities were associated. This development went hand in hand with the rise of the Atlantic trade of enslaved African peoples and the practice of enslavement. Firstly, it is worth distinguishing between the term races and race. All right, here we have a newspaper article, White Slavery or Selling White Men for Debt. We have received from Indianapolis a certified copy under the broad scale of the state of Indiana, 11th, 30th, 31st section of the Act of 1807, approved by General Harrison, providing for the sale of white men and women in certain cases, and also third section of the Act of regulating elections, approved like manner, requiring property qualification and voters for representatives. All right, white people were being sold. This is the 1800s. Okay, Indiana. Morocco, white slaves in Morocco, Indiana.
There was once a time when the royal courts of Europe echoed with languages from North Africa and the Sahel. A time when black men and women walked among kings, not as servants or slaves, but as rulers, warriors, scholars, and nobles. Today, their memory has been buried beneath centuries of revisionism, colonization, and denial. But the traces remain. And if you follow the footprints, the truth emerges, one that reshapes how we understand European history. It begins with the Moors. In 711 AD, these North African Muslims, many of whom were dark-skinned Berbers and sub-Saharan Africans, crossed into the Iberian Peninsula. With brilliant military strategy and a thirst for knowledge, they conquered vast parts of modern-day Spain and Portugal. For nearly 800 years, they ruled cities like Cordoba, Granada, and Seville. Under their reign, Europe saw a golden age of architecture, science, medicine, and philosophy. But these were not merely foreign occupiers. Many of the Moors intermarried, built dynasties, and left their mark in art, literature, and royal bloodlines. You can still see their presence in medieval coats of arms, where the face of a black man, often crowned, is known as the Moor's head. These weren't caricatures, they were badges of nobility and power. Saint Maurice, a Roman general from Thebes in Egypt, was one of the most revered Christian saints of medieval Europe. His image, dark-skinned, regal, and armored, was worshipped in cathedrals across Germany, France, and Switzerland. In a world slowly beginning to idolize whiteness, a black man was still the image of divine nobility. As centuries passed, the presence of black nobility became more complex. In Renaissance Italy, the Medici court hosted black diplomats, scholars, and even a mixed-race duke. Alessandro de' Medici, born in 1510, was the first Duke of Florence and head of the powerful Medici family. His father was Lorenzo de' Medici, but his mother was a black servant, or possibly even a noblewoman of African descent. Known as Il Moro, he ruled with authority until his assassination. His legacy later softened or erased in art and books. In Britain, the royal bloodline itself carried African ancestry. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the wife of King George III, was descended from a black Portuguese noblewoman named Madragana. Contemporary portraits of Queen Charlotte showed her with distinct African features: full lips, dark complexion, tightly curled hair. But as the centuries wore on, later paintings lightened her skin and altered her appearance, removing the evidence of blackness from the public eye. Even Napoleon's Empress, Josephine, hailed from Martinique, where her Creole background tied her to African lineage. It was not uncommon for noble lines across Europe to carry traces of African ancestry, especially through connections with Spain, Portugal, and their Moorish past. But as Europe expanded its colonial ambitions, something dark unfolded. The very presence of blackness in European nobility became problematic. With the rise of scientific racism in the 18th and 19th centuries, the idea of black royalty was deemed unacceptable. Paintings were altered, family trees were revised, scholars omitted details. Even museums quietly hid or reclassified African influence artifacts. The fall of the Black Royals wasn't a single event. It was a slow and deliberate erasure, a rewriting of history to conform to a narrative of white supremacy. The Moors were cast out of Spain in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west. Their libraries were burned, their architecture was renamed, and their legacy was buried under centuries of European nationalism. Today, traces of this forgotten past still linger in coats of arms, in the names of cities, in the bloodlines of monarchs who would never speak of it publicly. The Moor's head still adorns noble family crests in Germany, Switzerland, and Sicily. Statues of Saint Maurice still stand, his face untouched by revisionism, and genealogists continue to uncover evidence of African ancestry in the DNA of European aristocrats. The rise of black royalty in Europe is a truth history tried to erase, but truth, like royalty, has a way of resurfacing. It challenges everything we've been told about power, race, and identity. It forces us to ask, if black blood once ruled thrones in Europe, why has the world been taught to believe that blackness and royalty could never coexist? This is not mythology. It is memory. Memory that has survived centuries of silence, and now demands to be heard.